On paper, the American paratrooper should have been easy to beat. German commanders knew the theory of airborne warfare, and they knew its weaknesses better than most. They had paid for that knowledge in blood during their own costly airborne assault on Crete earlier in the war. A paratrooper jumps in lightly armed. He lands scattered, often miles from his comrades, without heavy weapons, without vehicles, without reliable supply, deep behind enemy lines. By every conventional measure, he is at a terrible disadvantage. And so German commanders, facing the American airborne, expected to mop up isolated, confused, under-equipped men. They were wrong, and the way they were wrong taught them something they never forgot. The first great test came in Normandy. In the darkness before the dawn of the invasion, thousands of American paratroopers dropped behind the German coastal defenses, and the drop was, in many ways, a disaster. Exactly the kind of disaster the German commanders had predicted. The aircraft, dodging flak and clouds, scattered their loads across the countryside. Paratroopers landed far from their objectives, alone or in tiny groups, lost in the dark, in unfamiliar hedgerow country, surrounded by the enemy. By the German playbook, this scattered force should have been combat ineffective. And here is where the German commander's calculation broke down. The very scattering that should have destroyed the American airborne instead created a different kind of nightmare. Small bands of paratroopers, often led by whatever sergeant or lieutenant happened to be present, did not wait for orders or try to reach their original objectives. They improvised. They attacked whatever was in front of them. They cut telephone lines, ambushed convoys, seized crossroads, and created chaos across the entire German rear. For the German commanders, the effect was paralyzing. They could not form a clear picture of the threat, because the threat was everywhere and nowhere. Reports flooded in of American paratroopers in a dozen places at once. Was it a major attack here or a raid there? Where was the main effort? The scattered drop by accident produced exactly the confusion that made it impossible for the Germans to respond in a coordinated way during the critical hours of the invasion. The Germans had counted on the paratroopers' disorganization. They had not counted on the paratroopers being comfortable with it. This was the deeper thing the German commanders had underestimated, not the equipment of the American airborne, but the mentality. These were elite volunteers, trained relentlessly, selected for aggression and independence, conditioned to keep fighting when isolated, leaderless, and outnumbered. A German commander expected a surrounded, scattered enemy to seek to surrender or escape. The American paratrooper, trained for precisely that situation, instead became more dangerous when cut off, because being cut off was what he had been built for. The lesson was driven home again at Bastogne. When the German offensive surged through the Ardennes, it surrounded the town and the American airborne troops defending it. Once again, the conventional logic was clear. Surrounded, outnumbered, short of ammunition, cut off from supply in the freezing cold, the defenders should have collapsed. And once again, the paratroopers did the opposite. They held the perimeter against repeated assault, fighting in the snow with whatever they had, refusing the German surrender demand with open contempt, and buying the time that turned the entire battle. German accounts of facing the American airborne carry a distinct note of respect, sometimes grudging, sometimes outright. These were not the soft, scattered, easily beaten troops the doctrine had promised. They were tenacious beyond reason, aggressive when they should have been desperate, and cohesive even when physically scattered across the landscape. The Germans had judged the paratroopers by their equipment and their tactical situation. They had failed to account for the thing that does not show up on a strength report: the will and training of the men themselves. There is an irony here worth noting. The Germans, who had pioneered airborne warfare, who had once dropped their own elite from the sky in daring assaults, should have understood the breed better than anyone. But they had largely abandoned large-scale airborne operations after their own painful losses, and perhaps that made them too quick to write off the concept and the men who embodied it. They saw the lightly armed soldier falling from the sky and forgot that the soldier mattered more than the weight he carried. So, why did German commanders underestimate American paratroopers? Because they did the math on paper. Light weapons, scattered drops, no supply deep behind the lines, and the math said the airborne should fail. What the math could not capture was the kind of man who volunteered to jump into that situation and the training that taught him to thrive in it. The German commanders learned in the hedgerows of Normandy and the snow of Bastogne that you cannot weigh a paratrooper's courage on a scale of equipment. And it was a lesson written in the ruin of their own plans.